Good evening. Brazil has entered uncharted territory. Former President Bolsonaro, once the face of the country's populist right, has been sentenced to 27 years in prison for plotting to overturn the 2022 election. The Supreme Court's historic ruling breaks with centuries of impunity for coup plotters, but it also exposes tensions with Washington, where President Trump and his allies are pressuring Brazil over what they call political persecution. At the same time, Europe is facing its own political reckoning, not over democracy, but over money. In Paris and in London, successive governments have been punished for daring to confront the soaring costs of aging populations. With debt climbing and services squeezed, France and Britain are struggling to balance fairness for pensioners with the needs of younger generations. Tonight we examine how Brazil's bold experiment in accountability is reshaping its democracy and diplomacy. Then we turn to Europe's deepening battle over pensions and fiscal stability. I'm Mark Summers. This is In Focus. Welcome to tonight's program. Writing in Foreign Policy, Catherine Osborne calls Bolsonaro's conviction a watershed moment. For the first time, Brazil has sent a clear signal that democracy cannot be subverted without consequence. Bolsonaro's conviction for armed conspiracy and attempts to abolish the rule of law crowns years of turmoil, false claims of fraud after losing to Lula, plots to cling to power, and the storming of government buildings in January 2023. Yet the court's decision has ignited a diplomatic storm with Washington. Secretary of State Marco Rubio denounced the ruling as persecution, while President Trump has slapped tariffs on Brazilian goods and hinted at more sanctions to defend his longtime ally. For Brasilia, the challenge is twofold: consolidate its institutions at home and resist foreign retaliation abroad. Lula's government is betting on trade diversification and support from US businesses affected by tariffs. But the pressure is real, and Bolsonaro's allies are lobbying for amnesty or reduced sentences. Whether Brazil can hold the line will define its political maturity. Now, joining us now is Tobias Belgrano, who is an international political consultant, to discuss what Bolsonaro's sentencing means for Brazil's democracy and how the country can navigate US pressure. Thank you very much for being here with us. Now, how unprecedented is Bolsonaro's conviction in Brazil's history of impunity for coup attempts?
Well, that can be read in two ways. Initially, yes, we can say it's unprecedented against coups. However, Brazil has a history of, especially with what is corruption of jailing its presidents, as the case of Collor de Mello or even Lula himself. So I wouldn't say it's so unprecedented. Even the perception we have in Latin America of Brazil's justice is that it's much more rough and less permissive than other judiciary systems in the region. And in the region also, this imprisonment of former presidents has also become the rule in recent years. Besides having Lula da Silva's case, and Bolsonaro right now's case, we also have Cristina Kirchner case and Gianni Áñez, Alan Garcia in Peru. So in Colombia also with Álvaro Uribe. So there's like a general trend in the region changing to that sense. So I wouldn't say so unprecedented in the region and in Brazil. However, in the judiciary history of Brazil, it's quite new that someone who tries to make a coup is arrested. That's why I would say it's accurate.
And do you think this sends a message to political leaders of the future who might be tempted to undermine elections?
Well, yes, of course. I think this is going to send a message. However, the tide has been changing a lot in the region. The Bolsonaro's governors of São Paulo, Tarcísio Mendes, has said he's going to try to ask for an amnesty for Bolsonaro by Congress, or furthermore, if the amnesty attempt doesn't work, they're going to try to indult him if this Bolsonarist governor, which is the most popular governor related to Bolsonarism, the most potential heir of Bolsonarism, gets to power. They're going to try to indult him. Meanwhile, the defense of former President Bolsonaro are going to try to take this to international courts to see how they can release the president, the former president.
Now, of course, the United States has taken an interest in this for some obvious similarities after January 6th in the United States, when Trump was accused of trying to overthrow an election. Of course, Bolsonaro was seen as the Latin Trump in many quarters. The US has put some sanctions and tariffs on Brazil. Is this significant? Is this going to cause problems for Brazil?
Yeah, but this is going to change a lot the balance of power in the region, which has already been changing. Brazil, I believe that this, at least during the Lula's presidency, is going to push even more deeper into Chinese arms of the Brazilian economy. Probably they are going to depend even more of the Chinese if the U.S. still sanctions the Brazilian economy. At the same time, this also has a lot of effects politically internally in Brazil, as Lula was going through some backlashes and challenges due to the economy. Last year's currency devaluation of the real was a problem in his popularity, and there was a lot of perception that his government was going in the wrong direction. However, this international discussion against Donald Trump has increased his popularity rather than eroding his government. So it's been helpful to Lula's popularity internally, this battle against the president of the United States.
And do you think that Lula da Silva's government has enough tools to protect the judicial independence from foreign pressures like those coming from Washington?
Well, yes, of course. We have seen another episodes of this intense intromission by Washington in Brazilian justice last year with Elon Musk discussions against Judge Alexandre de Moraes. That was a big issue internationally, speaking about how Brazil managed its justice system. However, there are some claims, and we have to say everything, that part of the judges that condemn Bolsonaro were named or were elected by PT presidents. I mean, Bolsonaro was condemned by 5 judges. 4 of them voted against him, and 4 of those who voted against him were named by Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff. So there are some complaints about the partiality of the process. However, this could be said the same about of the judiciary process of Lula da Silva, where the judge, after condemning Lula da Silva, was named Minister of Justice of Bolsonaro's government. So the attacks on partiality can be either ways. But yeah, this has been one of the criticisms of the Bolsonaro side of the discussion.
Yeah, of course, allies of Bolsonaro are going to try to exploit some public distrust of the Supreme Court's decision, and as you say, there are some worries about the impartiality of the Supreme Court. From your vantage point there in Argentina, from what you've heard, what do you think the public the public opinion is in Brazil. How are people reacting to this sentence, for instance?
Well, currently, Argentina is right now going through a more domestic process. I mean, we're more interested in the current elections, so probably the public is not that well informed or interested in the case of Bolsonaro. Of course, the closest people, Argentinians here are to the government, to the current libertarian government. They, of course, perceive that Lula is a dictator and he's trying to persecute Bolsonaro and his opposition. Also, internally, we have some of the libertarian advisors worked with Bolsonaro during his administration, and some of them are condemned by the Brazilian justice. I'm talking about some of the advisors of Javier Milei, especially in the digital militia area, which are being persecuted by the Brazilian justice, and there's have been also some requests of extradition for those advisors, which also consider that there's a persecution going on in Brazil.
Do you think there's a risk of overreach by the judiciary?
Well, no, I wouldn't say so. I do believe that the events during 2022 pushed by Bolsonaro were really a serious thing, and there was some kind of plot against democracy. And Bolsonaro was not we didn't have any intention of recognizing the results. So I do believe that's an attempt against democracy. And that's one of the many attempts Bolsonaro moved forward with, because he said the electoral system that his government was implementing was moving forward in a fraud. He even tried to make reforms in the electoral systems, and while the senators and deputies were discussing these reforms in the Congress, the government decided to do a military parade of tanks, like trying to intimidate the Congress. So. Yes, I would say this is a delicate situation.
And do you think Bolsonaro's case here in Brazil might influence Latin America as a whole and response to anti-democratic leaders in other countries too?
Well, at least yes, in the short term, we will really need to see what happens in the region in the coming years, especially in Brazil, because as I was mentioning, if there's a political change in the administration of the Brazilian government, probably Bolsonaro might get indicted, and that's the same, for example, thing they are saying about Cristina Kirchner here in Argentina. That if the political opposition, being left or right, of the imprisoned president gets to power, probably they will try to indulge that president. Could be Cristina Kirchner from the left or Jair Bolsonaro from the right. So I think that the dynamic might go that way.
And looking ahead to 2026 and beyond, do you think Brazil's political class can finally move beyond the polarization?
Well, I wouldn't say so, especially not only due to the Brazilian situation, especially about the Western situation. The events in the United States last week shows how polarization is increasing rather than decreasing. So, no, I think that the near future it's going to keep increasing the polarization, not only in Brazil, but in the West in general.
Yes, I think polarization is here to stay for at least the short term. Thank you very much, Tobias Belgrano, for sharing your thoughts on this landmark conviction in Brazil. So, as you've highlighted, Brazil's democracy is showing strength by holding former leaders accountable while pushing back against outside pressure. But while Brazil faces down populist backlash and foreign pressure, Europe is locked into a quieter but equally consequential fight: how to fund aging societies without undermining public finances or intergenerational fairness. The Financial Times warns that Britain and France are in thrall to pensioners. Over 2 decades, both countries have seen pension and health spending for older citizens outpace revenue growth, squeezing investment and driving debt. In Britain, the triple lock on state pensions guarantees rises on the pension above inflation or wage growth, shielding retirees while leaving younger workers exposed to higher taxes and weaker services. France faces an even starker imbalance. Pensioners now enjoy higher average incomes than the working age population, and protests greet even modest reforms such as raising the retirement age. As fiscal pressures mount, governments keep retreating from reform, fearful of public anger. But without new approaches, future budgets for education, housing and defence will be sacrificed to preserve benefits for a growing retired electorate. Joining us now is Meher Nicola Fursley, Director General of the World Pensions Council, to discuss why London and Paris are struggling to manage ageing costs. So, welcome to the programme. Why do you think France and Britain failed repeatedly to reform pensions, despite the clear fiscal warning signs?
Delighted to join you today. I think, and it's not wise to lump together Britain and France. They share a lot. So France and Britain share a lot in common. You could say they're joined at the hip, and they're probably, even though they speak different languages, they're probably the two closest big nations in Europe. However, in one field, which is aging and pensions, they're extremely different. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. It doesn't make much sense. Why am I saying so? To make a long story short, the system in France and Southern Europe and Eastern Europe is to a large extent pago. Pago meaning pay as you go. So what does it mean, pay as you go? It means that there's no real pension system in the Dutch, Anglo-Saxon, Australian sense. There's no real money. There's no pension pot. It's a fiction. When you have a pay as you go system like you have in France, it resembles what Americans call, in American English, social security, which is not pension. So what does it mean? It means at the end of every month, in real time, the trade unions and the government together, they take from the pay, from the paycheck of active workers, 3, 4, 5%, and they send it in real time to retirees with practically no buffer. So what I'm coming at, in countries like France and Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, there's no real pension. They use the word pension, but it's a fiction. In reality, it's like a tax. It's like a tax used in real time, paycheck to paycheck almost, to fund retirees. As long as there is strong economic growth, as long as French and Italian women have many children, the system works very well. But when there is demographic slowdown, when there's GDP growth slowdown, after 10, 15, 20 years of time lag, the system collapsing. This is exactly where we're going to in France and Italy in like 6, 7 years down the road. In Britain, the pension system is a little better because the pension pots are real. So there's real money invested by corporations and the government on behalf of future retirees. And the money is invested in bonds and equities over 30, 40, 50 years. And when you retire, you break the piggy bank, right? You take the money from a real pension pot. Last comment, in England, if you're a civil servant working at municipal, council, or national level, on average, you have a much better pension than if you work for the private sector. But even in the private sector, for middle class and upper middle class Brits, the pension system is actually very solid and very strong.
Now, I must declare an interest here because in 25 or 30 years' time, I will be getting, hopefully, if they still exist, a British pension. So I do have an interest in this. But for the young people who are working right now, they feel hard done by. Is it because simply that the reason why governments can't touch these pension pots or reduce pensions or increase retirement ages? Is it simply because the people who vote in elections are by and large people who are retired?
Very good point. So there are two phenomena here. Like for like, young people, tend to vote less. They tend to be less, politically involved. than the elderly, but also demographics, pure old-fashioned demographics, demographics is destiny, right? And so right now in countries like Britain and France, which have very similar demographic percentages, so if we look at the 40 to 60 years old group, they represent 28% of the people, which is a lot. And if we look at those who are age 60 and above 60, in France and Britain, they represent 26% of the population, which is also a lot. So you put them together, and those who are 40 and above, they represent nearly 58, 59% of the population in Britain and France. It's unheard of in the history of mankind. And so you have more and more gray-haired and white-haired and bald voters. And if you are the government, you can't antagonize them brutally because you will lose the elections 2 or 3 years later. And here there's a lexical problem, if I may add. Reform, right? Reform is an English word of French origin. And it's very fashionable. And that's why probably Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer, they both pretend to be reformist because it's a positively perceived word on the left and the right and the far right. And so that word is being misused today to hide a lot of things which are not truly reformist. One of the principles of reform is if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? And so the UK system is not broken. It doesn't need a big reform. It's a lie. The French system is completely broken and it needs a reform. But either way, there's a deeper problem. So it's not only pensions alone, it's a lot of things around pensions. It's also healthcare, the cost of healthcare, the NHS crisis in Britain. And here, Britain is much lower than France. Public hospitals, they work better in France and they are more efficient. So add to the cost of pensions, healthcare, and the cost of housing. If you're a young voter or young university graduate in London or Paris, buying a small flat has become beyond your means. Even if you went to an elite, whatever university, it's too expensive. So the cost of living, there's a big cost of living crisis for the younger generations, and it is progressively breaking that intergenerational solidarity because the old people say, I've worked like a dog all my life, I deserve a full pension. I don't want to sacrifice my pension to fund, the young, whatever, graduates. They have to work hard like I did 50 years ago. So here we're witnessing the beginning, perhaps, of a generational split like the one we had in the late 60s, which was an era of upheavals. Remember, late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of young versus old crises in America, Britain, and France. We may witness that. We may witness that in the future.
Is the problem, Nick, that we're just not dying? Because we used to be that when people retired, they might live 2-3 years claiming their pension, and then people would go and die. But now we might live 20-30 years after retirement age and be sick as well using health services. So is the problem that we're just not dying quick enough?
Maybe. The thing is, to be honest with you, poor and working class pensioners in Britain and America and France, they still die young. So these poor, the people who worked in factories or, textile mills or foundries, right, in Northern England or Manchester, all their lives, when they retire, because, they inhale the fumes of the foundries in the factory for 40 years, the odds are that 3, 4, 5 years after retirement, they will die. So actually that injustice, the fact that people are living longer and cashing in on their pension pot longer, it's mostly upper class or middle class pensioners who live longer. But anyway, I think it has to do with mismanagement, because in countries like Holland, Australia, Switzerland, and Sweden, people live as long as Britain and France, if not a little longer. And because the pension system in Holland, Australia, Scandinavia, Switzerland is very well managed jointly by the unions and the governments, guess what? There is no pension crisis in Holland or Denmark. There is a pension surplus, which means that it can be done if the government runs retirement rationally and efficiently, which is not really the case in Britain, but it's okay-ish in Britain, and it's not the case at all in France. In France, it's a complete disaster.
And just to the triple lock, which is what they have in Britain, is that fair? This is where the pension, the state pension, which everybody gets when they get to that age, it rises with inflation or with average wage growth. Is that fair or even sustainable?
Good question. It's very, very complicated. And that system, that is not the core part, not the core part of the pension system. I think the triple lock applies mostly to the minimal, like the minimal government, social security style pension, which everyone and their sister can claim. So here, probably the triple lock is a little perhaps excessive because it's putting what we call in our jargon actuarial stress on the system. What does it mean in plain English? It means, if you're an actuary, a pension or insurance actuary, you try to understand today, right now, what will be the future. Because if you cannot analyze today, right now, what will be the future in 5 or 10 years for your pension or insurance system and act accordingly, the whole system explodes, right? So the fact that, the triple lock is a little maybe too generous, blah, 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 it's putting stress on the system. But I would say in UK context, it's a small stress. It is not like a big issue. Let's look at Belgium, for example. Belgium is much worse. In Belgium, all salaries and most pensions, they are practically completely indexed to real life inflation. So here in Brussels or Antwerp, it's really horrible. And the whole system is submitted to gigantic pressure. I think in Britain, the triple lock thing is maybe not ideal. It's a little expensive, but it's not the main reason why the government, budget is in deficit. There are other bigger issues, other big sort of mismanagement issues that needs to be fixed by the UK government. A lot of money cash being burned elsewhere. For example, NHS, the NHS system in Britain is a disaster, and that is burning much more cash than the triple lock, right?
Well, we're talking here on a Saturday evening when there has been lots of unrest across different cities across Europe, across the world indeed, protesting at different things. There's been a massive protest in London today, more than 100,000 people on the streets protesting against immigration and asylum seekers, many racist movements involved in that. So we also have, of course, weekly demonstrations against Israel and pro-Palestinian marches. At a time where civil unrest seems to be something that is becoming more prevalent, do you foresee protests, people taking to the streets, young people perhaps, and social unrest about the unfairness, perceived unfairness of the situation?
Yes, Europe is in trouble. So I think, and being, being a cynical centrist, I think there's a lot of propaganda on the left and the right and the far right. And the first victim of that is truth. Truth is the first casualty. So I think, why do we see populism on the far right and the left on the rise, and maybe some young disenfranchised voters attracted by that discourse, is because of perceptions. And sometimes the governments do things which are ridiculous and outrageous, and they don't even realize it. A very interesting example in Britain, in the past 15 years, you've had 12 freshly minted billionaires, so not millionaires, but billionaires, who made a fortune in the past 15 years in Britain. How? Simply by buying empty hotel rooms, thousands of hotel rooms every day, right? Buying them long in advance, wholesale, from Holiday Inn, Sheraton, Travelodge, Ibis, and selling them with a 100 or
Indeed.
200% markup to the government, and the government used them to house refugees and immigrants, some of them asylum seekers.
It sounds like it's been a good way to make money. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Unfortunately, we didn't have more time to speak, but always a pleasure. Thank you very much, Meher Nicholas, firstly, joining us here to discuss the challenges behind Europe's pension dilemma. Thank you very much indeed. Now that brings us to the end of In Focus. From Brazil's stand for democratic accountability to Europe's struggle with the cost of aging. Today's discussions remind us that stability relies on courage, whether defending the rule of law or reforming policies that no longer serve the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.